Yeah, we're going to be talking about more Sinatra forms and basically the process of adding to a form. For example, here, if we wanted to create a book again, another way that we can make our inputs is by nesting them right within the labels. So this is just a small refactor just to show a different style. But down here, I'm thinking about how a book is going to take in an author. If we decided that author wasn't going to be a string field on a book model anymore, but author was going to be a separate table instead. So accordingly, uh, the schema might look something like this, right? Where we have a table books, and because a book is written by one author, we're going to say that it's like a one-to-many relationship. One author writes many books. A book belongs to one author. So then we'd have a book pointing back to its author ID as the foreign key. Over here, right, we just have an author with a name, and then once we run these migrations, we should expect to see like tables like authors in books like this. I think that actually I've dropped the database since creating that schema, so let me just make sure that I've got it. Oops. Migrate. Cool. So we created the two tables, books and authors, and we've got models set up for these as well. Very simple, right? Just class author, class book, right? So to kind of review how Active Record is designed to work alongside this primary key, foreign key relationship that we've set up, where an author ID on a book points to the author's ID, we could get into the database and play around with that for a little bit. So let's try that. Rake console. Let's check on book.all, author.all. Does that work? Cool. Let's get some books and authors connected in the database real quick. We've got a seed file here. There's a little bit more done in this Google Books adapter. If, like, once again, I'm going to put this code up. If you're curious about exactly how this piece is running, you can examine the code and ask questions at that point. I'm just going to try to keep it focused on our Sinatra work and our form stuff mostly today. So we've got these models ready to be represented. Let's seed the database. Oops, dbc. DB seed. There we go. Try that out. Oh no, and we got some sort of an error here. Rake DB seed. Undefined method author equals. Oh, this is interesting. Undefined method author equals for book ID nil, author ID nil, title nil, snippet nil. So I think they're saying here that like we have a book instance and we're trying to call author equals on it somewhere. Okay, so let's try to figure out where. If we look a couple steps down the stack trace here, we can see that it's inside of our app adapters Google Books in fetch books. So let's examine this adapter actually, just to see, because now this might actually have something to do with our association itself, and maybe we need to set up a connection here. So yeah, do you see right down here we have book equals book.new. And then they're explicitly saying book.author equals, and then they do an author.find or create by. Find or create by will either create a new instance. Sorry, let me flip the order here. It will either find an instance with this name, or if no instance exists, it's going to create a new one and save it to the database. But the essential thing is that we're trying to pass in an author instance as an argument for book.author equals. And that, because we have the namespace author on book under author ID, that's what tells me that we really need to have an association. Author equals seems to be expecting that book has a behavior on it called author, but right now, according to the schema, we'd only see author ID and author ID equals, and then also readers and writers for title and snippet. So if we want a book to have a readable and writable author, and not just an author ID, we have to take to the model. And how do I give the book a namespace model inside, or a namespace for author inside of this class that will allow Active Record to know which authors connect to that book, or which author connects? We could use a belongs to. Yeah, the purpose of these associations is not just to tell ourselves how these things connect, but to tell Ruby what behaviors we want. So if we say belongs to, I'm saying like make me a bunch of methods to get stuff out of the database. I'm going to give you a namespace author. This is all kind of review, but when I give Active Record the namespace author, it makes a couple of assumptions. It assumes that because I'm belonging, that I've probably got a foreign key author ID on this model, and of course I do. It's also assuming that there is such a table as authors because of the name that I gave it, and that's also true. And then it's also assuming on top of that that like the authors have an ID and that there's going to be some author in the table that it can find with the relationship where book.authorID equals authors.id, to use the kind of SQL. Cool. So I'm going to run this back. Let me check this seeds file one more time. At the top of the seeds file, we're destroying all the authors and books, so I can kind of run the seed file over and over until I know that these associations are on point. Cool, so let's try it again. RakeDB seed. And that time we actually went with no errors, so it had no problem going through the seeds file, going through this Google Books adapter step of setting .author equals, because now when it sees .author equals under the hood, it's going to take this author instance's ID and it's going to set it to this book's author ID field. That's the connection that we have implied when we said book belongs to author. From the other side of things, we'd have a has many relationship, right? Has many, and I wouldn't say book here, first of all, because it doesn't make sense semantically to say has many book, but also because active record is watching very closely for whether we have singular or plural names. A belongs to association should always have a singular name. A has many association should always have a plural name. Otherwise, active record isn't going to make the right assumptions about what you've named your classes and tables under the hood. In any case, if I've written the has many books on author, I haven't explicitly tested it by running seeds because nothing happened inside of this Google Books adapter that called like author.books to test whether we had that. So if I'm going to test one side of the association, I should probably test the other before I move on. I'm going to hop into the console, pull up one author, and see if we can get their books. A equals author. Sorry, let me move this up to the top. Author.first. There's our first author, and we'll say a.books. And here's all the books that have the same ID for author ID as what I've got as my own ID as this first author. And we can scroll through and see more information on these books. Same kind of stuff that we've had on before. Cool. So now that we've got a good awareness of how our models associate together, that we have this one-to-many relationship because of the primary and the foreign key being the same between an author ID and a book author ID. And we've also been able to go into the console and test those connections explicitly. Now I know I'm not going to get into a position where I'm like in Sinatra and running into an error that's not a view error or a controller error, but is actually a problem with my model or migration, right? The main thing in my workflow that I try to guard against is once I'm done with writing a model and a migration and associations, I'd like to be able to get onto the web and stay on the web without having to like come back to the drawing board, dig into the database more deeply, play around more in the console to make sure that things are connected, because each time I have to go back and forth between like coding in the browser and coding in the console, I feel like it's a little exhausting and time consuming, so I'd rather just get it done while I'm getting started. That's why I spend a little more time in the console to make sure that I'm on the right page. But now I think we are, so let's shotgun. And now I think we can start playing on the web, talking about how to create a book that's associated with an author at the time that the book is created. One thing about belongs to, by the way, that's a little tricky, is that when you say a book belongs to an author, that book depends on the existence of that author now. So it might actually be difficult for us to create a book if we don't provide an author. Let me open a new tab here. So I've got my shotgun tab that's running, and then I'm going to have this console tab so I can test one thing. Is it going to be possible for us to even save a book to the database without an author ID? Book.new, title is something, snippet is some stuff, and there's no author ID on this, right? Just say book is whatever I had. If I call book.save, will it save? It says true, so yeah, let's check out book. Yeah, I got an ID. Author ID is nil here. Cool. So I was able to save a book without an author. That could create some confusion later on. I just wanted to make sure if I tried to do this and I didn't have the author hooked up right away, that I wouldn't be getting an error that wasn't from Sinatra. In other versions of active record, you might find that this has flipped and that you're unable to save something that does not have the foreign key once you've got the association. And if that's the case, you can totally say optional true. I believe that's the syntax. Let me make sure. Belongs to optional active record. Yeah, it's a Rails 5 thing. So it depends on the version of Rails that you happen to have. So belongs to associations are validated unless optional is set to true. Validation, once again, we haven't talked about it yet, but it's a process that keeps things from being saved to the database. So for example, just to show like what might happen in a different version of code, is something along the lines of when you write belongs to author, Rails under the hood or active record under the hood is going to write something like this. Validates presence of author ID. This is part of the check that it would be doing under the hood, right? If I really do depend on the existence of an author, that would mean that I need to have a foreign key in my book, but it would also do another check under the hood to see whether or not that author even existed in the database, because that would be a problem too. But in any case, let me put this validation on just so you can see in other versions of Active Record as you do more Sinatra work and as we move into Rails, how that might play out. So if I go in here again and I make a new book, book.new, no author, and then I say underscore.save, or sorry, let me say b equals underscore, and then b.save. Now it says false, and then if I say b.errors, it's going to tell me why it couldn't save. And it says that author ID can't be blank, right? So there's under the hood, sometimes validations like this one get applied. I'm not going to put it on there now. I'm just going to worry about the association. But if I took a look at like my gem file lock here, yeah, so since I'm in like Active Record 6 and not necessarily running Active Record 5, which is where this issue came from, I might not be running into that error as often right now, but who knows? Just kind of be aware of which version you're in and know that sometimes belongs to gets a little bit squirrely once you put that association in there about letting you save if the ID is not present. Cool. We've got our shotgun up. Let's go into a new localhost session and let's just play around a little bit. Fleshed this out a little bit more from like the starter stuff that we had going. Oh no, undefined method needs migration for active record migrator class. So here's a thing that happens sometimes. I'm going to check out config.ru line 3 because this is where this boot error is coming from. Somebody else might see this error on their computer too. I've run into it a few times. And here's what we do. The thing is that my version of Active Record is not the same as the version that they're assuming that I have that calls this needs migration thing. They're trying to stop me from being able to run a shotgun if I don't have all of my migrations run yet. But I know for a fact I just ran those migrations. We only had 2 to run and they just went through. So I'm literally just going to comment this out and be careful on my own to make sure that I've got my migrations run before I shotgun. Because otherwise I'm just going to be artificially like snagged in trying to change around versions of stuff. Let me hop back to my shotgun here. I'm going to start it back up just to be safe. There we go. And we'll refresh. There we go. Sweet. So here's book lister, right? We got a little CSS on it now. We can view all of our books. Oh no! Undefined method name for nil class. So here's a thing that happens if we don't have all of our information lined up, regardless of whether it lets me save or not. Before I can even get into the place of like creating a new book, I've got an error in this app, and it's happening here on this line where it wants to call book.author.name. But if we remember before, we've just saved a book to the database that has no author. So this book with a nil author ID is not a good one to have in our database because our app right now assumes that every single book has an author we can call a name on. So I'm going to hop into the console and I'm going to make that true for this book. We'll say book.last equals book. Cool. And we'll say book.author ID equals 2 and book.save. Having saved that book with the no author ID, I feel like that's the only book that's not going to be associated with an author. Cool. And so now we can see like all of the books that we have on our list. Just wanted to make sure that we had basic functionality there after playing around with our stuff in the console. So we have this create new for a book, and it's going to take us to a form. And what I want to talk about today primarily is all of this stuff that we know about how a book connects to an author. How do we make that real in terms of our Sinatra app? I like to think about this kind of working backwards. And in terms of what do I need my database to say when a book is created, when it's all done. So looking at the schema, I'm going to need to have a book in the database that has an author ID that's a number, a title and a snippet that are strings. title and snippet seem taken care of right here. I need to find a way to get an element onto this form that's going to send an author ID back to the controller, right? So let's see. I have some options here. The person could enter in a name into a text field of an author that they know exists, and then we could look up the author by their name and assign their ID in the controller. We could also do like the same deal with a name field and also a find or create by. But what I'd like to do is like some sort of like HTML dropdown where we can just select from a list of given authors. And if we check this out, I'm going to go down to the Mozilla because we went to W3 schools yesterday. I'm just going to mix up my doc stuff. But there is this HTML select element, right? And this will give us a control that has options. It looks kind of like this when you go into your browser. We click on cat, click on spider, and it shows the thing that like we've chosen here. How does that work? Well, if we look at the code, we've got this pattern of a select element which contains one or more option elements. So the select element here is what gets the name attribute. So whatever goes over the wire when params gets its key based on how we've like named a field, right? If we look at our new form again, right here where it says name title, right? That's going to associate with title key in the params hash. This is going to create a snippet key in the params hash. Over here, this is going to create a pets key in the params hash. So I label that in the select itself. Each of the options are where we provide the value for that key value pair. So that's something I'd like to play around with a little bit as we dig into this form. Let's try it out here. I'm going to say select, and the name will be author ID because that's what we're trying to set. And then let's see, we need to close the select tag. And in order to make sure that the author ID is the value here, I think we're going to need to like interpolate. We need to call like author.id to fill the string for a given value on an option. And we'd probably need to call author.name to fill in this piece, which is what the user sees to select from in their menu. That tells me I'm going to need to interpolate Ruby. It also kind of feels to me like I'm going to need to iterate because I've got more than one author and I don't know how many authors I have. In my pseudocode would kind of be something like this, like for each author there is, create an option tag, that displays name and sets ID as value. Something like that. Cool. And then I will comment this out for posterity. And that's just one of these. And one of these. Or maybe not. Did I miss my closer? Oh dear. In any case. Sorry about that. I'm not going to worry about the comment right now. Something about how my ERB is coloring is a little weird. So I'm just going to let it ride. Cool. So this is what I'm trying to do. For each author there is, let's discuss that. How do I get each author there is, and whose responsibility is it to do that? Anyone? Yeah, in the controller, I think that, yeah, each author, that feels like a model-based kind of thing, and I think that it's going to be up to the controller to ask for it. This app, I'm trying to do the multiple controller thing from some of the labs toward the end of yesterday. So just a quick word on these controllers, right? We've got an application controller, which is setting up our config from yesterday, like where we know where our views folder is and making sure that we have that method override for any put or delete requests. And then we have other controllers that we name, and they inherit from application controller. And the last thing that you really need to know is that in your config.ru, if you create a new controller with name, you need to say use and then the name of that controller above your final line where you run the application controller. So all that kind of stuff needs to be together, right? We need to add a controller and have it inherit from application, and then in config.ru, we need to use the use keyword to make sure that that controller's routes are available to us. But yeah, starting in the controller, right? Thinking about books new, when we have this form, we could totally go to the database, right, and say like author.all, could be our value for any sort of authors. We don't need to just have one instance variable in some of these routes, right? So here, book equals book.new. The idea here is that if we ever had any issue like displaying info, that we could like talk to an object itself. I'm not even really sure that we're going to need the book.new for now. I just want to focus on this authors thing. Because if I'm here in this controller and I'm rendering books/new, and once again, because we've got multiple controllers, I've got multiple folders now because there's going to be different indexes for authors and books, and I'd rather have the same name for the action, but kind of namespaced in an individual folder here. So if we look in books at new, that's what renders from the books controller. And so for each author there is, I think that we could just write in each loop here. We could say something like an embed and say at authors dot each do author. So now I know that whatever I do, I'm going to do it once per each author that there is. Let me end this before I forget. So we need to create an option tag that displays name and sets ID as value. So let's create an option tag. For each author, we're going to create an option. And now I might have to go back and like check my syntax here. So value is going to equal whatever we send back over the wire. So we'll say value equals, and then we'll interpolate the author's ID. And before the option tag closes, we'll have to display the name of the author. I'm kind of curious. I'm wondering how much this order really matters to, but we can try it a couple of different ways. So let's see. Let's go back and refresh this page. Undefined method, title for nil class. Oh no. So name is title, value equals at book.title. Oh, interesting. So here's the reason that I wanted at book, right? If I don't have at book, then it's not letting me fill in like any existing information for at book. So I think that the idea here is that if we ever had some sort of like error handling, we might want to come back to this form with some version of at book that might be partially filled in so that the user could just see like the form render. I'm going to leave it here, and I think that we might be able to get into some error handling toward the end of this just to kind of show why that's there, for the sake of like restfulness and giving the user the impression of memory, even though we're stateless. In any case, let's come back to this. We've got a drop down that now lets us select between two different authors, and I'm really curious what's going to happen in the controller at the create action. Before we even do any sort of creating, I'm going to do a binding.pry so we can explore what happens to params with this new kind of input. So I'm going to say test 2 words. Cool. And then we'll click on submit. This should hang up and get us into a pry session. Sure enough does. We're in pry over on the left-hand tab. And we should be able to say params to check on what we've got from the user. And yeah, title is test, snippet is 2 words, and author ID is 3. I want to contrast this real quick. Did we save our book, by the way? I think we might have. Yeah, we sure enough did. That's great. Let's go ahead and create a new book. So this field here is important to configure correctly. If I misconfigure it, we're going to get some wonky stuff. So like if I said like author.name and then I said author.id here, that's going to throw us off a little bit, right? Now we see the IDs of the author, right? And if I'm seeing the IDs, then that's going to tell me that probably what I send back is going to be the name. So over here, params. Yeah, now author ID is going to be Madeline, right? Which I'm not sure I really want, right? I'm not going to be able to save that as an author ID field. It's not even, somehow it like even cut off the name of the author, which I'm not super happy about either. Not great. So we want to make sure that we are showing the user in between the opening and closing tag and sending to our controller at the value asset attribute. Let me make sure that I have some space between opening and closing tags. I'm also going to, sometimes you see people like explicitly put quotes around like the value part, or sorry, anytime we have an attribute and value pair, whatever the thing on the right hand side of the equal sign is, when you're writing HTML, oftentimes it helps to like wrap it up in explicit quotes, both to like help you remember when a string started and ended, and to help the browser not be ambiguous based on whatever value Ruby returns. Cool. So in this controller, how did that book actually get created? We called book.new, title of params title, snippet of params snippet, author ID of params author ID. And yeah, now we have some kind of conditional error handling going on here. So we have if book.save, redirect to books book ID, else ERB books new. I think that this is appropriate now to talk about like less than happy paths for a quick second, now that we've got a book connecting with an author a little bit. If we go ahead here and look at all of our books, right? We go to the last book that we made, which was by Stephen King. Sorry, let me click on the title instead. It's our test book, right? It tells us like who our author is. It links back to that. So all the creation stuff is working as long as like the book has all of the attributes, right? It needs to be able to have like a snippet. It needs to be able to have a title. It definitely needs to be able to have an author. Let's actually set those expectations here. Let's talk about how a book can or can't save. So I'm going to say validates title, presence true. I'm going to say validates snippet, presence true, and validates author ID. There's other kinds of validations too. Like if I didn't want two books to have the exact same title, I could enforce that with a uniqueness validation. And if you look up active record validations, there's a ton of stuff about them. I'm going to hold off on some of them in terms of like labs around them, because a lot of our labs on validation are Rails focused, but I do want to show this to people right now because I think it's an important concept that we don't want to hold off for too long. So uniqueness true means basically not only does a title have to be there, but it can't be the same as any other book title that's there, right? So each of these things is going to basically sit there watching an object, and then as an object is about to save to a database, it's going to run any validation that exists on that object. If any validation fails, then errors are added to the object, and an object with errors on it cannot be valid and cannot save to the database. This is a way to let our Ruby objects kind of change and grow over time to a point that they can be saved, while still letting us have an object that can't be saved into the database right yet. I'm thinking about like a tic-tac-toe game, which needs 2 players. You might need to create a game that doesn't yet have the second player assigned to it before like starting the game, right? And then the second player comes in and joins the game. So you might have a game that doesn't have the 2 players that are required for it at all times in the life cycle of the game. We might have a book that doesn't have a snippet yet, and we might add the snippet at a later step. But until we have everything, it's not going to save it to the database. That's the important step. I'm going to go and try to break this now. I'm going to try to make a book that doesn't work. I go to create new, and let's look at this form real quick. We've just got a form, right? Nothing else going on except that we've got it wrapped in like a section tag. That's for like CSS stuff. But simple form, input type submit. We have these 3 labels, 3 inputs, and nothing else really going on. So in our books controller here, if our book successfully saves, we're redirecting to the book show route. Otherwise, we're staying on this post. This is the one time it's okay to render from like a post or a put, is if we fail to do the thing, right? We're here to save a book. If the book doesn't save, it is potentially okay to stay here and show the user the form again. At this point, the user would have partial information for a book, right? So when we first get to this form, the book has no information. So when we call .title, .snippet, nil comes back, and we have no value in these fields. They start out blank. But what if I just wrote a title and forgot a snippet? Circle of silence. And then we say submit. Oh, and you know what? I've got a binding.pry here. So let's take a look at what just happened. We've got params. Pardon me, my computer got a little slow there for a second. Oops. Oh my goodness. My A key seems to be busted. There we go. Oh dear. I'm having big slowdowns on my machine, y'all. Apologies. Let's see if there's anything I can jettison here. Goodbye, Slack. Goodbye, Adam. Goodbye, Goodbye notes. Good night, moon. Let's try again. You know what? I might have to hop out of this pry session and try it again on the second run through. Let's try this. Pry is slowing me way, way down. And my computer is getting hot. Sorry, y'all. Exit. Typing each character, this feels like the end of like an RPG game where they slow you down on purpose to make you feel like the gravity of what you're doing. Oh, see, and it didn't even take the thing I typed. Let's try this again. E, X, I, T. Oh, dear. Well, we're going to Control Z it. Goodbye. We'll stop our shotgun. We will run our shotgun again. And now what do we get? Oh no, this happens from time to time. So we have this traceback, shotgun in main, address already in use. So what just happened is I had an issue in a pry session, right? I had my pry running from the controller when I went to create a book. I get into a pry session. Pry really slowed me down, so I did like a hard stop on pry. But pry was also happening in the middle of a shotgun session. So now I have like a process running about shotgun, which is keeping me from doing other shotgun stuff, right? I can keep trying this, and I'm going to get the same error. Address already in use. Address already in use. A couple ways to handle this. I could go to my activity monitor. This won't be the same if you have a Linux machine. You'll have to do a different thing like in the terminal. I can show you both ways. But this happens often enough that if you go to activity monitor and then like alphabetize by process name and then look for processes called Ruby, one of these processes is the shotgun process that is impeding me. They all have different process IDs, 54723, 55321, 55571, 54711. I can kill these processes, right? So 54723, I can say kill 54723. And it's not there on the list anymore. 55321 is the next one. Goodbye. Am I in a console session? Probably. Oh no, I quit out. Cool. Let's see. 55571. Okay. Let me check this out again. Looks like some of these aren't actually getting done with though. 55321 is still there. 55571 is still there. So you can kill with fire, but it's not necessarily recommended unless the first way doesn't work. Check those out. Yeah, now 54711 is the only remaining one. Let's kill that one too. -9 it. Cool. So yeah, sometimes you run into situations where that you double up on your shotgun. This should work again. The other way to track and see what a running shotgun process is, and you can do this from a Linux machine or a Mac machine, is to say ps space aux space and then a single pipe character, and then we say grep and then the word that we're searching for. So we could say Ruby here. And we get a couple of results, right? One of these results is literally grep Ruby. So it's like a mirror telling you, yeah, you just searched for Ruby. So we're looking for any running process that includes the word Ruby. So the one that we just ran technically counts because of the word we used. But this one here, process number 55698, is the one that's currently running shotgun in my other tab. Cool. Anyways, let's get back and take a look at this create process. I'm going to probably attempt now to take the binding.pry out. And what I'm going to do is p params, and then I'm also going to p a bunch of asterisks, because when pry stops working, I just get diligent about like signposting stuff. And then I'll say p at book dot valid, and then we'll also say p at book dot errors. Dot valid is what gets called under the hood anyway when we call dot save. So by calling valid early, it lets me populate errors on a book if the book is not valid and lets me see why the book did not save. Cool. So let's check this out and see how this flow works. We have our shotgun running. We'll go back to books new. Let's go ahead and make a book with just a title, promising to finish it in the next sprint by Madeline Longo. Submit. Cool. No method error. This is good. Undefined method each for nil class. So here's an interesting piece. We have undefined method each for nil class, and it's coming from new.erb at authors.each. Well, this is weird. Why is it talking about new.erb when I don't have new in my URL? I'm only really used to seeing new.erb when I've got books/new as the place that I am. So how could I be at a URL that says books and have the code be trying to do new.erb stuff? Any thoughts on that when we look at the controller together? Very good. Yeah, we're in the else. So if we take a look at our actual output here before our error happened, I might have to scroll up a bit. That's why I use these asterisks, right? So here were our params. We had a title and we had a no snippet, and then we had an author ID. And then we attempted to save our book, and was it valid? Valid was false. And then we had errors display. And the errors here was that the snippet was blank, right? Snippet is the key that we're looking at, and then error is blank. Or under messages, we can say snippet can't be blank. As a matter of fact, let's make errors a little easier to read. We have this option too. Errors.full messages. This returns an array of strings where like everything is kind of like married together for you based on the hash that you gave it. So if I submit this exact same one and I look at my output again, scroll down to the next spot where we ran into it, catch it right here. Yeah, so now we have this array of strings, right? Snippet can't be blank. So very clearly, like, I know as a programmer why this book wouldn't save, but right now all the user sees is this error of like authors.each. And yeah, as we said, the error is happening because since the book doesn't save, we can't do the if thing. Therefore, we're here at books new. And the last place that we did books new, we set two instance variables. We set at book to populate the form fields if they had any, and then we also set authors, right? And authors was so we could populate this dropdown. So we're trying to re-render the dropdown menu in the post route, but the post route doesn't have access to the same variables that we had at the other route. And this is another way to kind of underscore that when we move route to route, we really literally just lose everything that was at the previous route. So if I want to have access to something called authors, I have to set it, right? Before we have an ERB re-render, maybe we should go and grab author.all again so that we can render that ERB usefully. This still isn't going to make our user feel very supported yet, though. So if I go and make a book, just Yo as the title, we have Stephen King as the author, because he gets a little lazier every year. I could see him doing that. Cool. So we click, and now I'm still here, right? I look at my terminal output. Let me Command K this and click Submit again. Right? Behind the scenes, tons of stuff happening, right? If we go through and read these logs, like we had our params, and then we do a select on some stuff, and then we get a book. We're trying to see what's happening with our validity of a book. It's not valid. The snippet can't be blank. And then right here, we go and get our authors, and then we re-render, and we're at the post route. And we don't see it, right? Because the user just kind of goes back to this form. And the user just kind of goes back to this form because the form is designed to show information on an existing book. So since we're at the post route now, and we can tell because of the URL, at the post route, we have at book coming from the params that the user gave us. So this is a very nice kindness for the user. It basically lets us, like, if I put a snippet here and no title, and then submit, those are the new attributes on the book. And then when we render that, the form just kind of stays the same. The problem here is that, like, from the user's perspective, they're going to keep on clicking submit, and then the button is going to show that it's not clicked, and the page is loading, and nothing's happening to me, right? Nothing that I can see as a user that's going to direct me to, like, fill in a title for this book. So if we have these errors, right, title can't be blank, how can I tell the user that there are these errors? Well, errors.full messages is an array of strings. So what I think we could do is we could go into like our new, and we could like display errors like above the form right here. Maybe we could say like book.errors.fullmessages.each do error, and then we will do an end on this. And for each error, let's do like an H3 tag so that it's like super serious. And we'll interpolate the error here with a render. Oops, well, can't win them all. All right. Cool. So there's my extra percentage sign. something like this, right? Let's go and make a book badly and see if we can see that display above the form. So we go to submit. Ooh, fantastic. Title can't be blank. Now if we leave the snippet blank, right, we go to submit this way, we'll get title can't be blank, snippet can't be blank. What about that uniqueness thing? Never change, bro. And I do think that there was like the circle of quiet, right? That I changed and then felt guilty about. Yeah, title has already been taken. So the uniqueness validation is working under the hood for this too. Basically, every time we're trying to save a book now, it's running through all of these checks, and we've devised a way in the controller to control whether or not a given book saves, right? And what we do in that eventuality. If it saves, we're done with creation, so we just go to the book to prove that it was created. If it doesn't save, we have to get the stuff back to build our form, and then we're going to re-render books new, except we've also got this way in books new to like render any errors. So let's just make one more new book to make sure that the whole loop is good. We're here, title, snippet. Yeah, things seem to be working okay. Now, here's a thing that could have broken this, right? What if instead of saying book.errors.fullMessages, what if I said like @errors.fullMessages, right? Or what if we did this? What if we said errors.each? And what if in the controller I just wanted a variable called errors? @errors equals @book.errors.fullMessages. I see people do this a whole lot. This should still work, like if a book doesn't save correctly. We should still be able to see errors display. But the issue here now is that I've created another instance variable that's just for this route, right? So what do you think is going to happen if I try to go back to books new at this point? Let's find out. Yeah, I always had that instance variable book, so saying book.errors.fullMessages was fine, but now we have this variable errors that sometimes exists when we render books new, and other times doesn't exist, right, when we render books new. And right now it's saying, like, we can't do an each over a nil class. So something that you see a whole lot is, like, some sort of conditional wrapping around all of this. Well, they'll say just something like if errors. What's nice about having a namespace like just errors instead of like book.errors too is that sometimes we find ways to make this particular kind of code reusable. And then we can like basically snip it out like a partial chunk of HTML and just add it to any form for any kind of object. But now that we have this if, I think that it'll render when it's a brand new book. Great. And then we have an X on here for some reason. Oh yeah, sure. Let's refresh. Title. Great. Submit. Snippet can't be blank. Great. So this flow basically is a validation flow. And the reason that we talked so much about separating new and save yesterday is to prepare you for being really kind when you make your apps and telling users like what you need from them. We're going to talk much more about validations in more detail with Rails and such. But I guess at this point, it's been like 45 minutes and I've been going through a whole lot of stuff. I want to pause and take any questions as far as designing like these drop downs, anticipating what params need to be, validating user input, controlling the flow between like redirecting or rendering, and keeping track of instance variables that we need along the way. Any thoughts on any of that stuff so far? Good question. In general, I want to redirect off of a post, put, or delete route. The exception to that is if the work of posting, putting, or deleting has not finished for some reason, and then that's kind of the only time that it's appropriate to render on a post, put, or delete. At a get route, you could redirect or render depending on what you're doing at the route, right? Like if I had a URL shortener app, I could have a get route where somebody types in the shortened URL, and the whole job of that URL would be to redirect to the long version of the URL. So it's hard to say like for sure in a get route what you're going to do at that get route. But generally with REST, we say that if a post works, I don't need to be there anymore because I don't want to have a page that I can refresh and keep posting to the database, right? At this point, if I'm looking at an ERB and staying at a post route, I was here because I had bad data that wouldn't save. If I keep refreshing that form, that's probably not going to hurt things too much because that form was not submitted correctly the first time. I'm not going to touch the database multiple times. The intent is to make sure that any sort of post, put, or delete, which will make changes to the database, that we don't linger there by rendering once the change has successfully been made, because that could provide a user an opportunity to accidentally click refresh and, for example, like buy a second set of concert tickets, right? Or delete an extra person from their tour reservation when they only meant to delete one. So we don't want to have like a form submission able to be refreshed. But aside from the case where something doesn't get created, yeah, we can just redirect off of a post. You notice here that like when we do a patch here, right? Same kind of thing. If we're able to do our update, then we'd redirect. Otherwise, we'd render. Deleting, it's pretty simple. Like we're going to destroy a book based on an ID, and if we can't, regardless, we're going to redirect, right? There's nothing to render on a delete because if we've deleted, then there's nothing to see there anymore. So yeah, post, put, delete, patch, all kind of redirect conventionally. And actually, as programmers, we're always attempting to find ways to not even have to render at the post or put or delete, but we don't yet have all the tools that we need in our box to be able to handle all of that. So for now, it's okay to render on a post if you're doing error handling, essentially. It's okay to render on a put if you're doing error handling. Otherwise, I would prefer to redirect off of those because it's more conventional. Other questions? So we've got a create flow on books. And one thing that I want to do here is that if we notice here, right, when we do an update on a book, they're just saying if book update space params, that's just an alias for saying like book update params here, right? If we got book update space params, that would tell me that like params has title, author ID, and snippet. Let's go and look at a book. If you all go to a certain book, we go to edit the book. We change wrinkle to stitch. It's like a Disney crossover. It takes place in Hawaii. Cool. So we have a stitch in time. We can edit the book. That saves just fine, right? What I'd like to do after changing this back, because I do get nervous every time I mess with my childhood. So that works, right? Because we can mass assign with update. We can mass assign with new. So I kind of want to get past doing just title, params, title, snippet, params, snippet, author ID, params, author ID. And I think I could just say params here on book new. Because we looked at the params several times before. And when we did look at the params, let me see if I can find one of the printouts of them. Right? If this was our params, we could totally pass this in as an argument to book.new or book.update and have it like read as a valid Ruby. What I would like to propose is being a little more deliberate about this. We're used to a params hash right now kind of starting out as an empty hash for us. That's because we're in Sinatra and not a lot of other stuff has been like configured for us. But once we get into Rails at the end of the week, params is going to start having other stuff in there. Params is going to start containing like information about whether the overall hash is even a permittable one according to some Rails standards. It's going to have information about like what it said on the button that was clicked when the user clicked it. Did it say like create book or create author, right? Essentially params, we won't be able to count on it just having the keys and values that we put in there manually. So we need to have a way to create a special namespace inside of params. What I'm kind of envisioning here is something along the lines of this. If I went into a console or really just an IRB session for this, and we said that like params was an empty hash, right? What we've been kind of doing is saying params title is whatever like the user types, right? So we say params title equals user input. Then we look at our params again, and then we have the hash that's starting to build out, right? And it's kind of look like the one that we just saw in the terminal output, params author ID equals 3. And I could think of like every time a user like selects a dropdown in a form or types into a field, that I'm kind of setting params this way, right? Because the name was title, the name was author ID. What if I had a different namespace though? What if I decided to do something like this? Reset params to an empty hash. And then I said params book is another empty hash. Now I could have something like params system type. Maybe I'm sending that along from like the request. And I say like Mac OS. right? Now I look at params. I've got system type in here that has nothing to do with a book I'm trying to create, but that's fine because I also created a special hash named book that lives inside of params, nested, right? So in this nested book hash, I could then say like params book title is some title. Right? Now when we look at params, we have this namespace book that gives us just keys and values that are about a book, and then anything else that like lives in params that might muddy up our book creation, we can kind of ignore. We could just talk about params book is what I'd like to start doing. To do that, we just need to make a small syntactic change. Instead of saying name title, we can nest inside of a namespace by naming the namespace and then using brackets. So if I say book bracket title, what I'm really saying is make me a subhash in params called book and set the key in that subhash that we're making right now to be title. And I can do the same thing here with book snippet. And indeed with the select too, book bracket author ID. They don't need to be symbols in this case because I am not, when I'm in HTML, I'm using a special like HTML input syntax. This is where it gets really confusing. I'd use the colons and stuff in the controller to like retrieve keys from params, right? Because then they're set as keys. But what I'm really doing here is just setting a special syntax. This is an HTML syntax basically saying like nest things in this format basically, and you can even have as you see with like the Pirates Lab, you'll see this kind of syntax, which basically means there might be more than one of these that I'm creating that have the same name. So like if possible, make an array of all of the book snippets and like number them. But this is like an HTML form syntax. We don't put colons in here. That's more the concern of like Ruby code when we're reading the hashes. Basically what I'm saying here is I didn't have to use a colon here, right, when I said title. And what happened was that params got a key called title. What I'm saying here is that I want params to have a key called book, and in the value of that key, I want there to be another key called title. So when I say book bracket, that implicitly tells params I need to have a nested hash called book. And within that nested hash, there needs to be a key called title. That's kind of like what I'm communicating. If I wanted to double nest it, right, I might say like book title like real or something like that. I'm not sure if I need to nest that deeply though. But all I'm trying to say here is instead of just putting something flatly into the params hash, I want to nest this key inside of another thing. I'm going to hop into the controller so we can actually see how this looks real quick. And I'm going to print out params when we do it. P params. And we'll do a bunch of asterisks right above just to make sure that we can see it. I think that's going to be the easiest way to take a look at it. And by the way, I don't think my book's going to save because book new params I think is not going to play very nicely with the new syntax that I just wrote. Let's see. Create new. Let's give it a title. Ronald goes to college. Clown college. Oh, I did. I made that joke. That's fantastic. Great. So happy. So we click. Yeah, it doesn't like that at all. Book new params. Unknown attribute book for book. Sure, unknown attribute book for book because we tried to pass in params, and the only key in params now is book, right? Sorry, that's the wrong params with book. Let me go up here to look at our actual params. Sorry. Here it is. Our only key is book. Book points to a nested hash. And the nested hash has a title and a snippet and an author ID. So when I said book title in the form, that's all I was really doing, was saying like I don't just want there to be a key title for the value that the user puts in. I want that key title to live in a context that is namespaced book. So there needs to be a nested hash where the key is book and the value is the hash itself. And that is going to be how we manage to like get title, snippet, and author under a shared namespace in the params hash. This is basically just an organizational syntax tool. And when we have situations where we would rather separate some of our params from other ones, we can use this. A lot of the form labs, like in the second half, are going to dig into this and show you more and more. And I just wanted to talk through it specifically. Basically, what you're doing when you write this is when it goes back over the wire, based on how the field is named, Rack picks it up before it goes to Sinatra and says, okay, my job is to build a params hash Sinatra style where the keys can be symbol or string access. And as I'm building that hash, what can I glean from what they wrote? As the param name, right? So when they get it, they see book title literally, and then before it gets to us at Ruby, they have converted it. Rack has converted it into the hash that we see here with the nesting. So yeah, it's a syntax that I drop here. I don't use colons because I'm not actually accessing values there or setting hashes literally. I'm using like this kind of string shorthand, anticipating that there's going to be some other entity between here and the controller that nests the hash appropriately as we go. I don't know if that clears that up. Beg pardon? Sorry. Yeah, the thing that you're going to notice a lot is like that generally when we use this, you're just going to start with the element that we're creating, right? When we name a nested params hash, it's important to name it according to what it's for. And so we say book title here. If we were going to do the same thing on like an author new, we'd say like name, author name, right? This will not be as important right now, but when we get into Rails, once again, it's going to be, particularly because all of the examples that you see with Rails parameters will have this same kind of nesting. So I just wanted people to get kind of used to that. So yeah, we came in here to really talk about how a book associates with an author, right? But along the way, we also kind of examined different ways to nest a params hash, and we also figured out ways that we can conditionally apply logic based on whether a book saves or not. We talked a little bit about how a book can't save if it fails validations, right? And how you can apply validations to a model to kind of be like a security guard to keep bad data out of a database. And we saw why we'd want to keep bad data out of the database at the very beginning when like it wasn't rendering a page because it assumed that every book had an author with a name, and that wasn't the case with every single book. This would keep us from having like a non-existent author or non-existent title, and that makes our books a little bit easier to work with. But ultimately, we need to tell the user what's going on. So there has to be some sort of error handling, and that error handling can get done the moment that we realize that a book didn't save. The only important thing there is to make sure that we do it conditionally, so that we're not like breaking our form when the user first gets there. I think those are kind of like the main pieces that I wanted to go over today. This literally kind of concludes a good chunk of the stuff that we're really learning as new material this week, right? So I want to stress that where we're at right now is today is about kind of catching up on labs, seeing how comfortable you can get with forms, particularly not just with like new item creation, but also like editing existing items, because that would require us to like pull more stuff from the controller at the time of edit, right? We had to go and find a given book, and then we had to populate a form with it in order to edit the existing book. When I upload this code, I think it's going to be a pretty good like bit of boilerplate to help you kind of jog your memory on some things, or to compare to your own controllers and see like, am I missing any steps? But I would also ask that you try not to like learn this stuff just by like reviewing other code and video. I think the best way to learn it is still by like practicing and trying to apply it by hand. Tomorrow there's going to be a pairing lab called Sinatra Playlister. And in that pairing lab, we're actually going to encounter some many-to-many association work. So based on what we're doing today with a one-to-many, we could also make it work with a many-to-many. We might just need like a second drop-down, right? If something belongs to two things instead of one, we could have a drop-down for the thing on the left, and we could have another drop-down for the thing on the right, a couple of different selects. That might mean that we'd need to have a couple of different types of objects. Basically, tomorrow is going to be kind of a complex challenge to pair on, so I think your goal of today is to gain facility with all of the basics that we've learned so far in terms of setting up controllers, setting up routes, embedding things into views, iterating over things, and most importantly, probably making sure that the user can get their params over into the controller, and that then you can handle that stuff in the controller to create and update the things that you want to do. Our general focus is going to continue to be like Sinatra, 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 just making app after app. That's why I left the note this morning about be aware of your own process. Particularly around celebrating small victories. I think one thing that you'll find as this week and mod goes on is probably you'll have like an energy valley around middle of next week. And partly it's because you've been here for a while at that point, but also I think because all through Mod 1, every lab you can do potentially in like 30 to 45 minutes, and some of these labs just take 2 to 3 hours to like get through every single step and understand what you're doing. So it's longer periods of time before like you feel like you've done a whole thing. So give yourself credit for doing parts of the thing, right? If you get a single route working, that's worth celebrating. If you manage to fix that bug in your view, high five someone, right? Well, don't high five, but do elbows, right? We're going to be safe with that. But in any case, celebrate those small victories as you go, and try to keep the steps of your work small in your mind and in your plans. Write down your plans if necessary and create like notes or lists, just so you're not trying to hang on to too much of this stuff all at once. And as always, ask for help if you get stuck on anything. I'm not sure if somebody snagged the second one-on-one slot for this afternoon, but I know I have one at 1 o'clock that's taken, and one at 1:30 that I haven't checked on this morning but might still be open. And I will be in a meeting from about 11 o'clock until lunch. But in the afternoon, I'll be more available on Slack as well to answer questions that come up. Are there any additional questions for right now before we get back into it? All right. Well, in that case, make sure that you're starting with your schema, understanding how things need to connect together in the database, and kind of working your way backwards from there, right? If I know I need to set a foreign key in the schema, then I know that I need to eventually set author ID, which means I know I need to call author ID at some point in the form, or else it won't come together. Think about like that kind of thread that goes through stuff, and may you find your next error very soon. Thanks a lot.